Welcome. This is a virtual Hill Day prep webinar in advance of our virtual Hill Day on March 3rd. That's part of our annual National Summit on Youth Homelessness. Our summit is fully virtual this year. My name is Darla Bardine. I'm the Executive Director of the National Network for Youth, and I'm joined by Ted Peso with the Night Ministry. He's going to introduce himself in a little bit. My pronouns are she and her. This is being recorded, so you will be able to share it and watch it later. Also, the slides for this presentation are going to be on our website after this, so you'll be able to access all of the slides and this recording later. Thank you so much for being here. So what we're going to cover today, a little bit about the National Network for Youth. For those of you who are new to us, we are on a mission to transform systems so that no young person in America experiences homelessness. We do this through federal policy advocacy, which we'll be talking about today. We also partner with youth and young adults with lived experience of homelessness. And we also provide on-the-ground support to communities through our community programs to help build strong collaborative relationships to prevent and end youth and young adult homelessness. So our agenda for today, Ted is going to be talking about virtual advocacy, what are the benefits of it, and some pro tips to be an effective advocate from the comfort of your home. Ted's also going to cover scheduling and preparing for your congressional meetings. And then I'm going to be talking about what are our congressional asks for the day, what's the current status of our legislation, and then just to be clear on our specific asks. And there will be time for Q&A at the end. Please feel free to use the chat function and just put your questions in throughout the presentation. If we don't answer them as we're going through the presentation, we'll definitely spend time to answer them at the end. And now I'm going to hand it over to Ted.
Thank you, Darla. Hi, everyone. My name is Ted Peso. I'm the Director of Strategic Partnerships at the Night Ministry in Chicago, Illinois. And I'm really happy to be with you today. My pronouns are he, him, his. And today we are going to be reviewing some tips about virtual advocacy and virtual lobby days. Do you want to go to the next slide? So this slide is a great place to start. I think this is a really powerful quote, which tells us that not only is it really important that we have a seat at the table where decisions are made about our lives and about our work, but we should be sitting at the head of that table to dictate what is on the menu, what the conversation's about, and how the food we're being served is prepared, right? So I think this is just a really strong place to center the conversation and kick us off. Next slide. So when we talk about effective advocacy, we're talking about three things. We want to engage the heart of the folks that we're speaking to. We want to influence their mind, and we want to make our legislators and their staff understand that there is a cost to not doing what we ask, right? And there's a benefit to doing what we ask. So let's start with engaging the heart. I think this is most effective by sharing stories of the work you do or the experiences that you've had as a young person experiencing homelessness. It could be through that personal story, but you can also make this through reflection about who the person is that you're meeting with. Let me talk about that a little bit more. Over the years, I've seen some young people frame their conversations in really beautiful ways with legislators. For example, several years ago, we met with the mayor of Chicago, Mayor Daley. And the young people, instead of sharing their stories about their experiences with homelessness, they entered the conversation talking to him as a parent. So how does he feel knowing that there are young people on the streets alone at night in the city that he leads? I thought it was a really effective way to start that meeting out and really connect with his heart, right? We've also met with congressmen who told us that they were saving money in their congressional budget by sleeping on the couch in their office when they were working in DC. And so the young people were able to pivot that conversation to be like, oh, you're couch surfing. That's something I did a lot before I found a shelter. Or we had another congressman who talked about the fact that he would sleep at the restaurant where he worked when the dorms would close because he wanted to work a few extra days before going home for holiday breaks. And so they talked about the fact that he was living in a place that wasn't meant for human habitation and that they did that too when they were homeless. So finding that thing in common really, I think, connected to the heart of those legislators and made the meeting pretty effective. Next, we want to influence our legislators' minds, right? So when you think about the work that your legislator and their staff are doing, they're charged with a vast spectrum of issue areas. So what you need to think about over the next couple of weeks is how to get them to understand that the issues that you're going to be talking about are things that they need to track closely in their state or in their congressional district. So I like to think of the staff that I'm working with on the Hill as people who are there to solve problems that I bring to them. So I try to frame my conversation with them in like, what's a problem that I see that they need to fix. So I think about where I see service gaps in the community, where federal policy isn't working. If you're a youth leader, think about where you face barriers as you are trying to access services. So for example, recently, the night ministry where I work was one of several providers that were getting tripped up by a new interpretation of a longtime regulation in the Runaway and Homeless Youth Act. If it went unaddressed, it could have resulted in a loss of beds or funding for our community. And so no legislator wants to hear that homeless youth in their community were potentially going to lose transitional living beds, especially during a pandemic. So when we were able to bring that to them, it connected with their mind, it identified a problem that they needed to solve, and gave them marching orders, right? So you also want to think about what data you can share to help tell that story. So think about things like the number of calls the National Runaway Safe Line receives from your state. Think about the number of homeless students who are enrolled in your school district. If they're helpful, you might want to think about the point in time count numbers for young people. There's a ton of new information that the pandemic has provided to us. So you could also use some of that data to tell how many young people or young adults in your community didn't have confidence that they would be able to pay next month's rent. So there's a lot of internal data out there that you can use. If you're a youth leader, you might want to think about how many times you visited programs that didn't feel safe or welcoming to you. You might want to think about how many calls you had to make in order to get services, or how many days you spent on waiting lists or on coordinated entry systems. You might want to think about times that you found it harder to get copies of your social security cards or other records during the pandemic. So information like that will be able to connect to that problem solver mind that many legislators or their staffs have. And then at the end, we want to really let our legislators know that if we don't address this, there's going to be a cost to the district you serve, and that could result in their political future being impacted. But if they help us solve these problems, there's a huge benefit. So another tip for this area is just show that you're not the only person with this concern. You have lots of people in your corner and that know that you're meeting with this legislator today. And so it's really important that they listen to you. Sometimes that you could schedule like call-in days or days when all of your supporters email that legislator, just to reiterate the message that you're sharing with them in person, just to show them that there's other people in your corner. Next slide. So once again, we are doing a virtual Hill Day. And I know people have been really nervous about virtual events, but really there's a lot of benefits to doing virtual advocacy. Like you can see on the slide, it allows so many more of us to participate. And our staffers and our legislators are still just as interested in the experiences that we're seeing in our communities and what they can do to help us. But that with that access, they're hearing a lot more issues from people in the community, right? So they're more accessible and more connected to all the issues going on in your community. So in order to make this type of a meeting work for you and your fellow advocates, there's a skill set that you have to acquire to make it work out well. Next slide. So the good thing is the network has a wide array of resources that will support you as you go to Virtual Hill Day this year. And you can see some of the links in this PowerPoint that will help guide you there. There's videos and there are toolkits available for you. Okay, so we're going to talk about the first steps to schedule your meeting. So the first thing is to identify who your US senators and your US House members are. This is really easy. You can just go to the website, enter in your address, and it'll tell you who it is. But the thing is, I think it's important to think about where you live and where you work. So those can be in two separate legislative districts. And so you might have a congressperson where you live, and that might be different than the place where you work. If your organization has sites in various locations around your community, you may have several congressmen who you would need to meet with. I think the other important thing is I witnessed a meeting one time between a young person and a legislator from another part of our state. That legislator represented the town that the young person lived in the first time they became homeless. The legislator was not someone who I would have been able to get a meeting with based on the geographic area that I work in and the geographic area that he represented. But the young person was able to get that meeting and share a message with him about the lack of support for families in crisis in his community, the lack of a safety net when that crisis escalated, and the experience of having to leave home and your home community in order to find services to survive in a different part of the state. That was a really important meeting because I don't think that legislator would have heard from a homeless youth provider had we not had that connection to his district. So you're going to identify who the senator and representatives that you need to meet with are. Then you're going to call or email to schedule a meeting. They'll usually have a general information email address. They may have a special email address to use if you're requesting a meeting. I always find it really helpful if you have a contact in the office, whether it's in DC or locally, copy that contact in on that meeting request. The next thing you're going to do is you're going to specify that the meeting is going to be virtual. And then kind of get an understanding of whether you need to send the link or whether they do. I'll tell you, most of the time when I request a meeting, I'm the person sending the link for the Zoom. You can ask for the elected official to join, but don't be discouraged that they're not in the room. I really value the opportunity to build relationships with staffers, and there's a few reasons for that. They're hungry for information, they want to impress their bosses, and they're often going to go elsewhere. So you can see this meeting as a helping hand to your colleagues who are in other parts of the state or in the country where that staffer might end up in the future. A congressman actually recently told me that his staff were our biggest advocates for an earmark request that we made to his office that he ended up choosing. He was talking about how he was really interested in supporting like zoos and museums and things like that, but his staffers were the ones who really pushed for our project. And that was really based on the relationship that we had formed with them. So that's really important. So when you're clear about who you want to meet with, you're going to you're going to make sure you have the appropriate staffers in the room. One thing I always run into, specifically when advocating for issues on homeless youth services, is that they often hear homelessness and they'll bring the person from HUD into the room, right? The staffer who connects with HUD. And that sometimes is a different staffer than the person who is working with Health and Human Services, right? Which is where the Runaway and Homeless Youth Act is based. So I'm really specific about the issues I'm going to be talking about. So instead of saying just homeless youth issues, I always say we're going to be talking about homeless youth issues, including the Runaway and Homeless Youth Act, which is based at HHS. And then they'll make sure that the right person is in the room. Next slide. Okay, so some tips. Research who you are meeting with. I think I went into this a little bit before, but you can, especially if you're meeting with the staffer, you can look for a LinkedIn profile, you can Google their name. You should always Google your legislator's name to look at some of the topics that they've been working on, some of their interests, some of the committees they sit on. Along the way, you might find out that you have a hometown in common. You might have gone to the same high school, the same college. You might have similar interests. Through this kind of research, I found out one of our congressmen in Chicago and I went to the same high school. I also learned that another congressman in Illinois has a father who was a longtime CEO at a homeless service organization in Central Illinois. So you can learn about what committees your legislator sits on in case that is pertinent to any information you'll be discussing. And Darla is going to talk a little bit about that later. You're also going to assign roles for your meeting. So you're going to want to choose a leader to lead that meeting. I always choose somebody that the legislator might be familiar with. If there's a young person in the room who feels really comfortable, it's a great experience for them to lead the meeting too. So you can work with them to craft the agenda for the meeting and have them lead the meeting. I think that can be really powerful for everyone at the table, right? You should plan for 15 minutes, but be prepared for a 30-minute meeting. So I always clarify at the start how long I have, and then I make sure that the folks who are there with me are really nimble and can adjust the issues that they're speaking on to the appropriate time. There have been times when I've expected a 30-minute meeting and the legislator has only been able to give us like 5 or 10 minutes, but that happens very rarely. Usually you'll get 15 to 30 minutes to speak. You're going to want to make sure you have a good internet connection at home. Also, when we're talking about virtual advocacy, it's very likely that the folks you're speaking with are not going to be visible on camera. I would not take that as a sign of disrespect. We never know where they're joining us from. They might be joining from home or somewhere else in DC. They might be in a crowded part of the office or somewhere in the Capitol building. And just realize that, staffers and legislators have Zoom fatigue, just like you and me. Take notes so that you're aware of what you're talking about and what your follow-up is. I would also add to this list something really important. If you are supporting a young person on Hill Day this year, make sure that they have equal access to be able to fully participate in meetings. So ask them what they need from you in terms of support. Do they need a quiet space in the shelter building or in your office? Do they need a stronger internet connection? Can you provide them with a laptop so they're not running it from their phones? Do they need headphones? You might need to walk them through Zoom if they're not familiar with how to use that platform or whatever platform you're using. You may want to offer a role play with them about how a lobbying meeting goes. And then I always like to provide our youth leaders with printed copies of anything that I'm going to be sharing with the legislator, just so that they know that they're on equal footing in the meeting with me and my colleagues at other organizations. Finally, compensate young people for their time if you're including them in your meetings. Remember that as employees of homeless youth organizations, we are getting paid to do this and provide our professional expertise. So it's important that our youth leaders be paid to provide their lived experience and lived expertise. Next slide. So here is a draft meeting agenda. You can read this through, and this is how your meeting would progress. I think this is a great draft meeting agenda. I also would suggest that you leave some time at the end to debrief as a group after the meeting ends. You can do that through a phone call, or you can just ask everyone to stay on and chat a little bit after the legislator or the staffer leaves the Zoom room. 4 questions I always ask the advocacy team that I'm working with is: how do you feel? What went well? What could have gone better? And what do we need to do next? And then I always ask youth leaders in the room if they want time to debrief separately. Next slide. So the ask. Every meeting should have at least one clear ask. You want to make sure your ask is clear and make sure that it's something that you can follow up on after the meeting. So you want to ask very directly: we are asking you to co-sponsor legislation XYZ. You don't want to say something like, we hope that you will consider supporting XYZ. Make it very direct. You can even ask them, when are you going to have a chance to speak with Congresswoman Smith about this, so that I know when I can follow up with you. Next slide. Reporting back after your meetings is really critical. The network needs to know how and if they should follow up with the office once you've spoken to them. I always forget to do this, so assign somebody on your team to do this. It's really, really important. And once again, the network has provided a ton of resources for your Hill meetings. So you can go to this link to learn more about how to do this. Darla?
Hey, everyone. Sorry. I'm going to try to turn my camera on and hopefully my internet will cooperate. So now we're going to shift to what some might consider more of the nerdy stuff, but just to share a little bit about kind of what is the current political landscape, what are our specific asks, who are some key targets. But of course, every member of Congress can certainly do something to move forward our agenda. So this is the current context for federal policy. So Democrats are in control of the House, the Senate, and the executive branch. But the Democratic majority is very narrow. The Senate is 50-50, and Vice President Kamala Harris is the tiebreaker. Congress is currently focused on appropriations. So they're focused on, FY22 appropriations. They are working on an omnibus right now. I heard that a deal may have been reached, And then as soon as that passes, we are expecting them to shift pretty quickly to FY23. There is rumor of potentially another COVID relief package, which may or may not get folded into a pared back, build back better plan, which is an infrastructure bill. There's a lot of work and focus on the new Supreme Court nomination. And then some of the bills that are getting more traction right now is the reauthorizations of the Violence Against Women Act and the Trafficking Victims Protection Act. And just to flag, these last two bullets are really within the Senate Judiciary Committee, which is a key committee for us as well, which I'll talk about more later. So our 4 buckets of advocacy asks for Hill Day are the Runaway and Homeless Youth Trafficking Prevention Act, increase federal funding for FY23, though our asks are the same for FY22 if anybody does ask about that, getting the Homeless Children and Youth Act passed, and then fixing the low-income housing student rule. And please put any questions in chat as we go. So first, I'm going to talk about the Runaway and Homeless Youth Trafficking Prevention Act. So this legislation would reauthorize and make key updates to the federal Runaway and Homeless Youth Act, which is administered at the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. So the current status is that we are waiting for bipartisan, bicameral legislation to be introduced in the Senate and the House. It is currently being drafted now. And our ask is that every committee that has jurisdiction, original jurisdiction over this legislation, makes it a priority, basically to move it through the committee by a vote. So the Senate committee with jurisdiction is the Senate Judiciary Committee, which is quite busy with Supreme Court nominations and other legislation. And then in the House, it's the House Ed and Labor Committee. And then another key ask, it doesn't matter what committee a member of Congress sits on. Once the bill is introduced, we do want every member of Congress that you all are meeting with to co-sponsor the legislation. So you can definitely say in your meeting, once the bill is introduced, I'm going to circle back and make sure you sign on to the legislation and be very direct. So for some folks who might not be familiar, the Runaway and Homeless Youth Act funds 5 specific programs right now. We're advocating for them to fund a 6th. So the first is street outreach. So that's really outreach and connecting to young people at risk of and experiencing homelessness. Basic center programs, which is short-term temporary crisis housing for minors. And then transitional living program, that's longer-term housing with supportive services for 16 to 22-year-olds. And then there's a national communication system, which currently funds 1-800-RUNAWAY, which is 24/7 national phone, text, chat. And then also training and technical assistance nationally is the 5th program. So our champions are the same, but both of our Democratic champions are actually retiring after this year. So all the more reason for us to really push and get this bill across the finish line this year. So in the Senate, it's Senators Leahy and Collins, and in the House, it's Representatives Yarmouth and Bacon. So we have asked for this bill to include a new optional prevention services program. So if you're applying for a basic center program or transitional living program or maternity group home grant, you could also apply for an additional $75,000 a year to provide prevention services to young people who are at risk of experiencing homelessness. The Runaway and Homeless Youth Trafficking Prevention Act would also make some other key updates, like increasing the age of eligibility for transitional living programs to 25. All grants would be for 5 years. Right now, some are for 5, other are for 3. It would require geographic distribution to be considered when grants are awarded by HHS. Programs would be required to provide training to staff on human trafficking, trauma, sexual abuse, and assaults. In law, there would be mandatory non-discriminatory practices. Right now, that's just in regulation. And it would also increase the length of stay for basic center programs. Another key update I forgot to put on this slide is it would fix the 20 bed per building issue that some providers have been facing. it would clarify that. And then some other key funding improvements. So if the Runaway and Homeless Youth Act is funded at less than 200 million, that's through the appropriations process, then grants awarded would be for 250,000 or less per year. If the Runaway and Homeless Youth Act is funded at more than 200 million in a fiscal year, then the grant award cap would raise from 250,000 a year to 275. And then on top of that, 250 or 275 a year, successful applicants would also potentially be able to get 75,000 per year for the prevention services program. And right now, current law is authorized funding at 152 million. This would increase it to 367.5 million. And the breakdown is here on this slide. And then also we clarified in law that Congress should appropriate an additional $2 million every 3 years for there to be periodic national estimates. So for those of you familiar with the Voices of Youth Count research conducted by Chapin Hall, that found the national prevalence in 2017 to be 4.2 million youth and young adults that experience homelessness. That similar study would be conducted every 3 years for the purpose of really kind of gauging our progress over time at preventing and reducing youth and young adult homelessness in America. So some key talking points: 4.2 million young people experience homelessness on their own every year. These programs are vital to scaling up youth-centric community responses to serve these 4.2 million youth. And just the urgency to make some really key updates to the Runaway and Homeless Youth Act program. This program hasn't been updated or improved in over a decade. So really highlighting some of the provisions I talked about about the need to combat trafficking and prohibit discrimination, the need to increase the length of stay, increase the age, increase the grant award amount, and overall program funding, and the really important need to fix the 20 bed per building regulation. So, oh my, sorry. So I'm not going to read all these names, but there are slides in here just so that you all can quickly see, hey, is there anybody on the Senate Judiciary Committee from my states that I'm meeting with? You can see, and then, you know, if any of your members of Congress that you're meeting with are on the Judiciary Committee, then I would definitely make it a priority to talk about the Runaway and Homeless Youth Trafficking Prevention Act, because they're going to have a lot of power over if that bill actually moves through committee and makes it across the finish line. And then obviously House committees have a lot more members because there's a lot more people in the House than the Senate. Again, look at this list. You can look at your state and see if anybody is on here. And again, these slides are going to be on our website, and this recording will be available, so you can always look back at this later. Okay, so now we're going to shift to FY 2023 funding. So typically the president's budget comes out in January or early February of every year. The president's budget is delayed again. Last year it was delayed as well. We heard the administration is waiting for FY 22 omnibus to pass before they release their 23 budget. So we are expecting the president to release their 2023 budget sometime in March. Now, the president's budget is not law. It is just an indication of what the administration's priorities are. And typically, depending on who's in the White House, that budget is only persuasive to that president's party. So the president's budget is only going to be persuasive to the Democrats in Congress, given the current administration. We will be putting out a call for action around Dear Colleague letters. Dear Colleague letters are basically letters that members of Congress write to other members of Congress. So in our case, these Dear Colleague letters are usually bipartisan, bicameral. We'll have one in the House and one in the Senate. And those letters will be asking the Appropriations Committee to increase funding for the Runaway and Homeless Youth Act program and the McKinney-Vento Education for Homeless Children and Youth Act program. So the more members of Congress that we get to sign on to those letters, the much more likely we are to see those increases in funding cross the finish line for FY 2023. We do have 4 specific funding asks for FY23, and we have some report language requests. And we do recommend that you focus your talking points. COVID is continuing to have impacts, an increasing number of youth in need. If you're a service provider, we're facing staffing shortages while we're seeing our wait lists increase. And then if you're a young person, just talking about the challenges of trying to transition to adulthood amid the pandemic, the affordable housing crisis, whatever is true to you, to really make that connection. So I already talked about the current status, and I mentioned before, they are still in the process of finalizing the FY22 budget. So if somebody asks about FY22, you can just tell them it's our same ask for FY23. But my understanding is the bill's pretty cooked, so I doubt folks will be asking you about FY22. I think a deal is imminent. So our specific ask is for $300 million for the Runaway and Homeless Youth Act program at HHS, $800 million for the Education for Homeless Children and Youth Act program, $100 million for the HUD Youth Homeless Demonstration Program, and $30 million for the Emergency Solutions Grant Program, also at HUD. So these are just some specific talking points. And then in terms of report language for the Runaway and Homeless Youth Act, so report language is basically bill text that you get in appropriations bill that is valid or persuasive for that fiscal year. So if we were to get report language, so we have gotten report language in HUD appropriations that says if you're 24 and under, then no third-party verification is required. And so that report language is good for whatever fiscal year appropriations bill that's in. So for the Runaway and Homeless Youth Act, we're asking for report language that allows RHYA providers to serve systems-involved youth, because there are some providers who are told that they can't serve juvenile justice or child welfare involved youth, and there doesn't seem to be a lot of clarity of what involved means. Also, language allowing RHYA providers to serve youth who are funded by other sources within the same program. So some providers have faced challenges as they're braiding different funding streams together to run a program, and being able to do that with RHYA dollars. I didn't include here, but there is also report language about the 20-bed issue. So, and Jim Bolas asked a question about the 20-bed rule issue. Ted, I don't know if you want to answer that. Just, you're in it. So I'll ask Ted to answer that.
Yes. So the issue that we were having is that some program officers and program managers within HHS were using a new interpretation of the rule, which would have forced programs that had multiple programs in one building to either reduce the number of beds or close programs. And so that is kind of the problem that we were facing with the rule, with the interpretation of the rule, and why there needed to be a fix.
Thanks, Ted. And so it really is the regulation that's the challenge, not the law. And so we're in a position where we really do need to get RHYTPA passed so we can kind of clarify in law, and then that'll be the impetus for updating and improving the current regulation. And so some talking points for the $300 million for the Runaway and Homeless Youth Act. I did some math. This would support approximately 1,400 RHYA projects in communities across the United States. So this would significantly increase the country's capacity to prevent and end youth and young adult homelessness. And just the impact, it would provide about 49,000 young people with access to housing and connect with 70,000 youth via street outreach and drop-in centers. And then for the $800 million for the Education for Homeless Children and Youth Act program, this is really asking for a continuation of the American Rescue Plan $800 million that was provided to really make the McKinney-Vento Education for Homeless Children and Youth Act program more flexible, and also allow community-based programs to receive funding and formally partner with public schools. So really, we want to keep that flexibility, that partnership moving forward. Also, just some data, public schools identified nearly 1.3 million homeless children and youth in 2019 to 20, and only 1 in 4 school districts actually receive any direct funding from the McKinney-Vento Education for Homeless Children and Youth program. So really kind of making it clear. This would help more school districts to receive the funding and keep that American Rescue Plan funding level moving forward. And then our final two asks, $100 million for the HUD Youth Homeless Demonstration Program. I think folks are familiar with it. The LIHTC money, it definitely has some flaws, but it really helps increase the capacity of communities to provide services and housing for young people experiencing homelessness, mainly young adults. And then even after that 2-year grant funding ends, that amount of money per youth turns into a set aside year after year. So if a community is awarded $3 million over 2 years, then after that LIHTC ends, they are guaranteed $1.5 million a year for youth-specific housing and services, even after that LIHTC. So it really becomes a set aside for young people in communities. And we also want report language, which I explained before. We want youth homeless demonstration programs to require that youth advisory boards and Runaway and Homeless Youth Act providers approve of the plan, and not in a token way, but they're actually involved in the crafting of the plan. Also, we want report language that requires 3% of the grant budget to go to paying for the youth advisory board creation, maintenance, paying young people for their time, paying for staff time that's helping to coordinate that. And then report language that would require all categories of homeless youth to be served. So right now, HUD's narrow definition is impacting which youth the LIHTCs are able to serve. And then our final request is $300 million for the Emergency Solutions Grant programs, and just some talking points like why it's so important to have supportive services and outreach to youth and families experiencing homelessness. And so these are the committees. Again, I'm not going to read them, but you can see, so there's 2 different subcommittees within the full appropriations committees. The Runaway and Homeless Youth Act and McKinney-Vento Education for Homeless Children and Youth Act are both under the Labor, Health and Human Services, Education and related agencies. So these are the members of that subcommittee in the Senate. And then these are the members in the House. And then with our HUD request, so both the LIHTC and ESG, that's a different subcommittee. It's the Subcommittee on Transportation, Housing, and Urban Development and related agencies. And these are the members of that subcommittee in the Senate and that subcommittee in the House. Obviously, anybody on the Appropriations Committee, no matter the subcommittee, definitely has a lot of influence over how much funding our programs get. But in particular, these subcommittee members have a lot of power when it comes to our specific asks. So the next thing I'll talk about is the low-income housing student rule fix. So right now, youth cannot live in low-income housing, tax credit funded housing, and be a full-time student. This means that young people either have to attend college part-time or they don't attend at all, both of which does result in young people not attending or completing higher education institutions. This is an issue because the drafters of this legislation wanted to prevent colleges and universities from using the LIHTC to build housing for their students, because most college students, absent their parents' income, would qualify as low income. But it was poorly written law. It should have been written better. So the solution is there's a simple no-cost legislation that would fix this issue so that youth can live in LIHTC funded housing and still pursue their education full-time. So there is language to fix this issue. There is some movement around trying to get it added to the FY22 final omnibus package. So there's two different asks. So right now, we're focusing on this first bullet. So in the there is bipartisan legislative text called the Housing for Homeless Students Act. Just include, it's like one page. Include that one page of legislative text in the FY22 omnibus legislation. It does not carry a cost. Our other ask is, it's more long-term, is to pass the Affordable Housing Credit and Improvement Act, which is a much, much larger bill, making a lot of improvements and changes to the low-income housing tax credit. And within that legislation, it also includes a fix to the student rules. So the first bullet is really a much more narrow, discrete, no-cost piece of legislation. And the second bullet is really a much broader reauthorization. And we are part of that coalition trying to push forward the Affordable Housing Credit Improvement Act. So next, the Homeless Children and Youth Act. This is bipartisan, bicameral legislation that would align the different federal definitions of homelessness across agencies and programs. Right now, HUD has a narrow and arbitrary definition of homelessness that does exclude many children, youth, and families. HCYA would align those definitions. So if you are considered under the Homeless Children and Youth Act, if you're considered homeless by the McKinney-Vento Education for Homeless Children and Youth Act program, Runaway and Homeless Youth Act, Violence Against Women Act, Healthcare for the Homeless Act, Child Care Block Grant, Head Start, if you're considered homeless under any of those programs definitions, then you would also be considered homeless and eligible for HUD homelessness assistance. Also, there are federal mandates and incentives that force communities to prioritize programs for certain populations and program models, regardless of what the local needs and program effectiveness are. HCYA would change that and require HUD to score local applications primarily on whether they are cost effective in meeting the priorities and goals that community identifies in their local plans. Right now, goals and priorities are really set at the federal and national level, not locally. The other thing it would do is, HUD data keeps many children, youth, and families invisible. And this is mainly the HUD point in time count. And so right now, what Congress sees is the HUD point in time count. And that's usually the metric that's used to determine which population should be a priority and where funding and programs should flow. So the Homeless Children and Youth Act would change that. It would improve HUD homeless data by requiring that communities do include children, youth, and families who meet any part of the newly amended definition of homelessness in local counts. And like, for example, HUD should include the McKinney-Vento education data in their annual report to Congress to show a much broader extent of child, youth, and family homelessness across the United States. So the current status is there is bipartisan legislation in the House and the Senate. During your meetings, you can ask them to co-sponsor HR 6287 in the House, and in the Senate, S1469. We just talked about our top 4 legislative priorities. Obviously, there's other legislation that we work on, but these are our priorities that are timely now. We also have a much broader list of priorities that does include administrative priorities. So administrative is, things that we think federal agencies should do that doesn't require Congress to act. You can see our presidential agenda for solving youth and young adult homelessness that we released last year. If you're not a member, we'd love you to join us as a member. We are opening it up for questions, but I did want to flag as well that we are helping folks schedule Hill meetings. If you need any support, I can pull staffer contacts for you. We have a tool for that. Definitely use our legislator lookup if you're not sure who your members of Congress are. And if you do want connected to other folks in your state, or you want me to schedule your meetings for you, I'm happy to do that. Some folks are not able to do the morning of March 3rd, either because they're on the West Coast or because of other scheduling things. You can certainly have your Hill meetings on March 4th or even the next week. You know, what's most important from our perspective is that you do schedule those meetings. We are speaking in a collective voice. And like Ted said, please remember to fill out the form afterwards. So I know, you know, that you had the meeting, whether it's March 3rd, March 4th, or later on in March. So I can do the follow-up on my end. And it looks like Carrie did share a link to our slide deck in chat, as well as a link to our legislator lookup tool. And actually that tool is, I love it because I'm a nerd, but it won't just show you who your member of Congress is. It'll give you contact information, staffer names, and it'll tell you through that lookup tool what committees they serve on. So you'll see if they're on the Senate Judiciary Committee, you'll see if they're on House Ed and Labor, or if they're on appropriations. What other questions? Are there any other questions, Ted, that you saw? And you can always email us afterwards. My email's right here. I'm pretty accessible.
And I will be available during the summit if anybody has questions about advocacy. You can always feel free to reach out.
Yes, we are doing, what are they called, Carrie?
We are doing something new this year called Ask the Experts rooms. These are virtual rooms that you can just hop on into, ask the expert whatever you'd like to ask them, and they will give you that answer, and then you can head on to your way. Or if you just want to pop in there and talk to somebody, that's okay too. We're excited about them.
Yeah, so we're really here as a resource. Our website has like draft emails, all the fact sheets, I mean, anything and everything, but definitely feel free to reach out. Email me anytime. I'm happy to help. And we'll see you at the summit or at the Ask the Expert room. I'll be doing one, Ted will be doing one. Well, I think that's it. If there's no more questions, we can wrap. We can give you 9 minutes back. Thank you all for being here. Thanks, Ted.
Thank you, Darla. I think that went well.
Yeah, it was good, right?
Yeah.
Thank you, Ted. You're a rock star. And I'm going to actually update some of those slides based on your comments.
Oh, yeah. I was going to add things, but then I thought like I could just talk about it.
Yeah. No, I'm going to do it. I have some notes I might ask you.
Okay.
All right. Thanks, Ted. Take
Great.
care.
I'll talk to you later. Bye,
All right.
Carrie. Thank you.
Thanks.